So I'm going to talk about how geography of art and culture had been transformed since the 1900s until the end of the First World War, and how it was observed, first of all, by Hungarian intelligentsia, people of periodicals. So when the First World War broke out, Paris had already lived for more than a century in the Hungarian imagination as the cultural capital of the world, la cité mère, as Victor Hugo said. Why in the Romantic era it was preferably called the city of world liberty, in the second part of the 19th century it was labeled as a sort of modern Babylon. Some Hungarian journalists referred to this biblical image, wanting to emphasize the vibrant modern life in the French metropole. Later, when Paris became more and more about modern arts, the nickname Mecca of modern arts was introduced as well. Why Paris had always attracted Hungarian writers and artists throughout the ages. The period starting in the late 1800s and ending with World War II proved to be the era of a real pilgrimage. A great number of the Hungarian intelligentsia and creatives visited the French capital in person. Feuilletons and articles were sent directly from Paris, conveying the significant attractiveness of the city. In order to appear perfectly up-to-date about the French capital, Hungarian dailies and periodicals even managed to have their own correspondent on the spot. Recognized as the cultural capital of the world, Paris served as a great model for urbanization, monuments, coffee culture, fashion, theater, literature, amusement. It was basically considered an emblem for the whole modern, energetic urban universe. Paris was seen as a cultural super capital from Pest, especially around 1900 during the Belle Epoque, and the same was true for Prague, Bucharest, or Belgrade. As a widespread and flourishing Paris mania appeared during the same period. Paris was called the nicest city of our planet in the mainstream liberal Hungarian press at the time. The super capital of human culture, the ancient Rome, welcoming pilgrims for all corners of the world. The period was characterized by a huge transmission of all sorts of cultural production, not only elite culture, but also popular culture from Paris was widely and regularly conveyed through literary, artistic, and other more encyclopaedic cultural periodicals. These periodicals had been very effective means to express a genuine cultural Francophilia in the context of a still existing, however, less and less cultural Germanophobia and a retreating political Francophilia around the turn of the 19th-20th century in the Hungarian part of the Austro-Hungarian Monarchy. For today, my selection are two periodicals, mainly two periodicals, Our Times and The Week. These are two literary periodicals with different culture orientation and readership. One was addressed to the so-called Hungarian middle class and nobility background families, both in towns and countryside. The other was directed towards urban citizens, mostly of Jewish origins, that both were very much keen on French culture. During this pre-war period, the number of pilgrims doubled. Not only educated people, but even workers went to visit the city of light, some on horse-drawn carts, some even on foot. An important change took place in this almost homogeneously admirative discourse in the Hungarian press when the 19th century transformations brought by industrialization, migration, imperial conquest, and rapid growth of cities, as Eleanor Acampo and Christopher E. Forts are claiming, became mainstream by the first years of the 20th century. This was the time when critics of this modern lifestyle began to accuse the French capital of the deterioration of its inhabitants' morals, thereby setting a bad example for cities and citizens. While the previous description of Paris as a modern-day Babylon reflected a more literary and generalist approach in the 19th century, this time the moral deterioration was put into a fanciac frame, namely the degeneration frame. Degeneration, the bad mental and physical state of citizens, was a set of ideas that appeared at the turn of 19th, 20th centuries, first in France, and was based on fears of mutations of modern lifestyle and social schemes, and on the weakened geopolitical status of France, and the fact that the early Third Republic in France suffered constant threats from different types of crises. This set of ideas was spreading effectively in other European countries as well, even in the Hungarian part of the Austro-Hungarian Monarchy, because fear of differences, the global competition, and national identity appeared everywhere. Furthermore, this diagnosis of degeneration was formulated in an utterly new, partly biologist rhetoric based on Darwinist ideas. In 1910, even the very liberal journalist and writer Zoltán Szász diagnosed an anthropologist and economic anemia as source of the Parisian decadence, due to which Paris was losing its intellectual fecundity. Nevertheless, he still praised Paris for its lasting privilege as a place where novelties show up. Szász referred to a double image of Paris that seemed quite common in the Hungarian press of the era: lavish Paris versus hardworking Paris. Wanting to avoid this oversimplification, Szász, this well-known and nuanced liberal journalist, preferred to stress a change in time. In the past, Paris used to be an intellectual word workshop that had now transformed into a place for theaters, shops, shop windows, and racetracks. As the representation of Paris seemed to have reached its zenith during the years preceding First World War, German cities like Berlin or Munich and even New York across the Atlantic were now praised as newly emerging cultural centers. According to the Hungarian observers as well, a more complex, polycentric geography of art and culture was in progress in the first decade of the 20th century, challenging the previous, more exclusively Paris-centered geography. During the explosion of the Great War in 1914, when France suddenly became an enemy of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, the cultural attractiveness of Paris was immediately questioned in the Hungarian press. As a journalist remembered a couple of years later, suddenly a darkness covered every metropolis of the world, even La Ville Lumière, La City of Light, Paris. Initially, a reconsideration of the cultural map of Europe took place in a direct political frame set by Hungarian cultural periodicals and press in general, in a very similar way as it happened in other belligerent countries as well. So here you can see an illustration showing a Zeppelin over in the sky above Paris. Accordingly, the French capital was suddenly demoted from center to periphery in the eyes of many members of the Hungarian intelligentsia, as they were now turning to Weimar or Berlin as the new European cultural centers. Some of them even saw an opportunity for Budapest to appear in the role of such a center, at least in the region. So here you can see some press illustration, how Paris and Berlin were changing places in Hungarian imagination. The decadent image of France and the French was widely discussed in the Hungarian press during the Great War. Paris was not only the capital of an enemy country, but also that of a republic with its broader engagement with ambiguous modernity. In the conservative pro-war monthly Magyar Figyelő, the Parisian intellectual life was depicted in 1917 still as a strong, beginning of quotation, a strong intoxicant having narcotized and crippled so many Hungarian children. Quoted in Catholic and other press, Ottokar Prohaska, the reformer and at the same time anti-Semitic bishop, reprehended writers for being bored on Hungarian soil and opting for Paris and Baudelaire. You can see Endre Ady as well, the most important modern poet of the era, who was targeted explicitly by the bishop. At the very beginning of the conflict, these same ex-Francophiles, like Endre Ady and others, all mourned the fall of Paris, not only as a political center, but even as a cultural one, revealing their old admiration for the European cultural supercapital. Ignotus, who you can see here, editor-in-chief of the review Nyugat West, published the following in his regular column in a daily paper. Over 50 years, a bridge has been constructed between Paris and Budapest where our sympathy could get through. Artists, writers, scientists, politicians, born in this era, they all looked to Paris. Right now, future artists and their followers look to Berlin rather than Paris. World history is about to blow out the flame in the pan, lit up for the French in the past. And if the sad news is confirmed, the culture fashion of turning to Paris will be broken. We mourn for Paris because we have lost it. This painful revelation of the secret love that characterized a small part of Hungarian intellectuals did not last long. As Paris was not seized by the Germans, and instead trench warfare became common all over Europe, a new discourse developed regarding the French, namely stressing the so-called civilizational conflict between France and Germany. In this frame of war culture, French culture was called decadent or cheesy, popular and valueless. The mainstream discourse based on a certain war culture, so what means a set of representations related to societies constant to war, was turned against France. Ultramodern French painters, for instance, were described as soldiers in camouflage in a daily newspaper, similar to the depiction of futurists in the Central Powers media. Interestingly enough, there was some truth in this description. Fernand Léger and others did in fact join the French army to paint camouflage. In 1917, in the Francophile weekly called A Hét, certain Alex, alias Elek Erdődy, even referred to the new war geography as if Paris was in Africa. Here you can see some illustrations related to this discursive strategy. So I quote this journalist, beginning of quotation, Paris is further away than the village Moba next to the river Shire where Zulus and Mata Bears live, end of quotation. Due to the use of troops of color on the European Western Front, France, and Great Britain as well, was widely disdained as uncivilized in the Central Powers press. Another discursive strategy was grieving for the Paris of the past. Simultaneously, a popular movie in Budapest was entitled The Crimes of Paris, bringing the dark mysteries of the word city into the light. In a short novel meant for young girls published by the ex-Francophile Our Times, Mysteries of Paris, a novel by Eugène Sue, published first in 1842-43 as a first series of novels in French and inspiring many similar descriptions of modern European cities, was not recommended anymore to female readers. At the same time, a reader of the same literary weekly, probably a young girl as well, received the following response from the editors under the motto collapse. We invite you for not having more serious problems in these serious times than waiting to see post-war Paris. If you excuse us, we are concerned with more serious problems than this. However, when more particularly after the long Battle of Verdun in 1916, French military defense and the resistance of the entire French society proved to be solid, Paris slowly regained a sort of respect, also from a cultural point of view. This mainly happened via nostalgic articles about the pre-war Paris, but also via articles sympathetic with how Paris survived during war times. Paris, beginning of quotation, breath again, a daily wrote. The liberal daily Pesti Napló, Journal of Pest, declared in April 1916 that Paris found itself and has become the capital of fashion once more. More and more articles were published mentioning Paris alongside other European cities such as Vienna and Berlin. But the French capital was no longer described as the word city, but only as one of the word cities. By the end of World War II, some critics talked about a blockade of art during the conflict. This finest creature of culture has missed the relationship with foreign art for years, beginning of quotation. And first we think about Paris. We have been isolated from its impact during the war. Therefore, we have no idea what is happening in the workshop of the West, what sort of route Western art took in the meantime. Paris is not on the top of the agenda. It is not the highest forum and the inspiring muse anymore, like it used to be for Hungarian culture and art. But new advantages and possibilities arise from this situation, the anonymous author of the critic claimed, namely relying on our humanity and the chance of developing an endemic art, which was at contrast with the illustration like this here. That was the last summer when Hungarian troops with Austro-Hungarian troops with German troops were preparing to defeat the French, but of course it happened differently. With a more radical rhetoric, and without a nationalist connotation, Hungarian avant-garde saw the role of the French capital completely devalued at the end of the conflict. The representatives of the new art, gathering around Lajos Kassák's avant-garde magazine today, claimed it was time to turn to Berlin rather than Paris. However, some radical French writers and poets were in fact propagated by the Hungarian avant-garde Cubism, also with French roots, was praised together with German-rooted expressionism in Kassák's magazine. Furthermore, in the 20s, when international avant-gardes, the partisan of decentralization in art, completely turned away from the French capital, Kassák still put Paris together with Berlin and Weimar on a visualized map. A map that was based on his half-real, half-imagined avant-garde network published in his journal during his Viennese emigration. More generally, and I come to the conclusion, in post-war and independent Hungary, while going through Trianon, name of the small palace in Versailles, where victorious power drew up the new borders within the Carpathian Basin, a great part of the Hungarian intelligentsia kept on praising Paris as the main European culture center, while the European avant-garde, later even Kassák's circle, turned its back on the French capital. Classical modernists remained interested. Representatives of Budapest popular culture scene even admired the total peace and progress on every level they saw in Paris, which they claimed was non-existent in Hungary in the 20s. A novice actress revealed the post-war Paris mania among youngsters through her own example. Beginning of quotation. Before I saw Paris, I felt a desire to visit it without knowing why I had this strong desire. Now that I know it, I like to return as soon as possible. I have joined the Lovers of Paris Club. In 1924, a Hungarian theaterman willing to forget Trianon linked the international dimension of the French capital to its cultural vitality. I quote, Paris, the heart of our heart, has recovered from the disease called the war and the post-war times. Paris is healthy. Its cheeks are ruddier than ever. Its heart is palpitating as 300,000 strangers arrive every day, according to the Central Statistical Office. Even it was an exaggeration. It was thanks to its international and modern metropole character that Paris became once again the object of admiration for many people in the 20s in Hungary. Thank you very much for your attention.